Okay, we're ready to start. This should be, if you have wondered about compliance, we have two compliance nerds to give us two very different perspectives. One is from a Canadian perspective, so the other north of the, I guess it would be the 48th parallel, is that right? And then also here in the US. So I'd like to present to you Joe Ciccolo with BitAML and Amber D. Scott with Outlier Solutions. And they're going to talk about compliance and regulations in changing times. Please welcome them.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You on?
So a compliance presentation would be nothing without disclaimers, so we'll start there, but I'm just going to leave it up and assume that everyone can read them. If you have questions, please go to the microphone in the middle, and because we have a short time with you today, I would ask that you ask questions that are questions. So if you have statements about how you really don't like regulation or government and you want me to listen to that, you have to buy me a glass of wine later. That's the deal. Okay, folks, today, questions only.
And I'll do it for a microbrew, so we're good.
There we go.
Awesome.
Now you know. I like Malbec.
All right.
So we wanted to start with just a quick story of how each of us became involved in the Bitcoin world, because it's one of the most common questions that we get. And the first time that I spoke at a Bitcoin conference in 2014, someone wrote an entire blog about how I must be some sort of government spy and they're from law enforcement and intending to do terrible things. But the real story is that the year before, a friend of mine who ran a payment processing company at the time had asked me about Bitcoin because he was starting to do processing for exchanges and it was becoming a ton of his business. And he wanted me to update his risk assessment. And I said, yeah, sure, I've heard of Bitcoin. I read about it in Wired. I don't really know much. Can you pay my retainer in Bitcoin? Because I have to be able to transact with it and really understand what it does. That was on a Thursday. He was like, yeah, I'll pay you on Monday. You're going to need a wallet. You're going to need to do security. Everything was command line at the time, so I was script kidding it up, canceling all my weekend plans. My husband was not impressed with me. And that was when I fell down the rabbit hole and really haven't stopped since.
Yeah, my story is not as exciting. I'm a legacy bank defector. I spent over a decade in bank compliance, working with various banks and non-bank financial institutions. Just one day I had this epiphany. I'd heard about Bitcoin at a conference, and it was a banking conference. It was really early on, and so the speaker really could have done a better job of not making it overly technical. And I was excited about it. It was something new, and I looked around the room, and there were all these bankers, and they're just shaking their heads. Oh, this is pixie dust. This is crazy. This will never work. Everybody should stay with the bank. It was that point I knew that this was going to be something special, because all the other bankers were saying this is going to be terrible. And I got back to my office, and I started looking around, and I said, wow, so you can send money, and you press a button on your phone, and it sends money. That's pretty cool. And I looked around the bank, and there was like filing cabinets, fax machines, all these artifacts that belong in the Smithsonian, not in a business. And so it was that point that I said, okay, now I've got to go consume everything I can about this. And as we say in the industry, I went down the rabbit hole, and I'm glad to say I haven't looked back.
Awesome.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the nexus between regulation and technology, or rather the lack thereof. And so we have two competing graphics here. From my perspective, with the animated video, it's sort of this unstoppable force and this immovable object where technology and regulation come together. I think Amber did a more analytical and skillful job breaking that down with her beautiful graph there on the other side.
2 by 2, it must be true, for the math geeks in the room. I think that the intersection that we often see where there's a lot of tension is that I can build a piece of technology, I can deploy it, and it's out today, and it's in the hands of the world. So it is instant, and it is global. And when we're talking about regulation, it is slow to change. Sometimes it's slow to get to even an interpretation, and it is very local. So you'll hear me often say things like, when people talk about global compliance or global regulation, that I think that's bullshit, because it's really hard to keep up with, pardon my language, but all of the regulation in all of the countries in all of the world. It would be tantamount to me saying that I speak every language in the world. Anybody? Would you believe me? I speak 3, and it's hard to keep up with fluency in all of those.
I speak one, sort of. Um, so beyond fear, uncertainty, and doubt, what are regulators really doing, right? So I think Amber said it before. Maybe there's some animosity or bone of contention we might have with regulators, but really there's just different ways of looking at risk and different ways of managing risk. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what they're trying to do as regulators, it all boils down to the lowest common denominator of protecting the consumer. And I'm sure we could have a lively debate on whether or not they're successful at that. But there are different ways that this is acting out in the marketplace. So either it's applying existing regulation, or regulators are creating new regulation, or they're just simply adopting what they already have. Do you want to add some color to that?
And one of the things that I think is really interesting there is that I'll often hear people say, will regulators try to regulate Bitcoin? And I haven't seen that happen in any meaningful way, but I have seen regulation that applies to things like exchanges, that applies to things like ICOs, but these really fall into that middle category where, or those first two categories where they're really saying, either this is how the law that exists already applies, and securities regulation has been around for
the 1930s with the SEC.
Many years.
Yeah.
We have regulation that applies to money transmission businesses, money services businesses, that's existed for quite a while as well. And for the most part, it's just saying, here's how we think that existing regulation applies. The situations that we have where we've tried to create new regulation, I think have been...
So what you mean is the bit license, right? So that's the example of creating new regulation versus updating regulation. Like the state of Washington said, okay, we have an ancient money transmission rule in the books. Why don't we just add virtual currency? And so they just sort of figuratively added a caret, and then they wrote virtual currency next to the other type of money transmitters, money services businesses. But as you mentioned, creating has been a bit license-like path.
Yeah. And even with BitLicense is not saying that I can't send Bitcoin to you in a peer-to-peer way.
Right.
It's really looking at the exchange-type businesses.
Right, and that's generally here in the US. Generally, the intersection between fiat and crypto and fiat, and crypto to crypto, that's generally where the regulation happens in terms of offering that as a financial service versus acting as a merchant, accepting that as payment, or two parties just transaction openly in the marketplace. Oops. The banking paradox.
So for anyone that's ever had Bitcoin in their business name, for anyone who's tried to explain to their bank that they're selling Bitcoin or that they're selling cryptocurrency, you've probably had a bank account closed. I'm
or
sorry
12.
for that. or many, many bank accounts closed. And this has become a really funny place. We actually did some research in Canada last summer where we commissioned a research assistant to call every bank, every credit union. We're much smaller in terms of the volume of bank and credit unions that we have, so it could be done in the summer, and get an answer about, if I'm a Bitcoin exchange that just does Canadian dollars to Bitcoin, can I open a bank account? And 1.47% of financial institutions that got back to us in the whole country said yes.
Yeah, it's not much different here in the US, right? So we haven't studied it here in the US, but I know from firsthand experience with clients and friends in the industry that it's just a sort of marketplace of deception where now the players in the crypto space are forced to lie. And so we have legalized businesses that register with the government, that have an AML program, that are doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. Now they're having to lie about who they are in order to just have a bank account. And it doesn't matter if you're exchanging Bitcoin or you own a flower shop or whatever you do, everybody needs a bank account for a business. And it's unfortunate that we have that dynamic. And to my banker friends in the room, I kind of went off on bankers at a conference recently. It's pretty easy to do. And I just said, look, it's been 9 years. What the F are you waiting for? What are you studying? You either are going to start banking or you have a good reason not to bank this group.
And I do have a lot of empathy for bankers in that banks deal with a lot of questions from their regulators when they do bank cryptocurrency businesses, when they do bank MSBs and money transfer organizations. But we have statements from the Financial Action Task Force, we have statements from the local regulators, most recently the Department of Finance in Canada, that say don't just consider everybody wholesale high risk, don't just close all the accounts of these businesses, manage the risk. And you have an interesting case study of how this is happening.
Yeah, so our firm, we work obviously almost exclusively in the crypto space, but of the traditional banks we work with, they've come to us because they're interested in the crypto space. And so our strategy when we work with these banks is to say to them, it's not a choice of yes and no. That's a false choice. Yes, I bank Bitcoin. No, I don't bank Bitcoin. What we lead with them is yes, but. Right? Yes, we bank crypto, but under these circumstances, under these business models, right? So, all right, this crypto thing's kind of new, but cash, cash doesn't have an audit trail, so maybe the Bitcoin ATMs aren't for us. Or foreign remittances, maybe if you can keep it domestic, we might be okay with that, right? So there are different dynamics you can get comfortable with, and ultimately our sort of perverse strategy on that is to sort of get a foot in the door and say, okay, let's see if we can increase your comfort level as you get to know the crypto players. And as you said, Amber, they're just legitimate businesses. They just want access to banking.
So what happens when a bank does bank crypto businesses?
So one of the banks that we've worked with, and I can't say which bank that is, but really it's just they have to do a little bit of a change in terms of some of the existing policies they have. So it's updating some of their policies and really knowing and creating the reality of banking with cryptos. And that includes just sort of gauging the actual risk, right? Looking into it a little bit more, understanding what are the true risks, getting away from the headlines, excuse me, and really creating policies and procedures that are inviting, and then at the same time adhere to the risk standards set forth.
Absolutely. And we do, I would say, at every level, every banker that I talk to is curious about Bitcoin, is if not curious about Bitcoin, curious about blockchain.
Mm-hmm.
There's a funny phenomenon where I think that every bank now has a blockchain project of some sort.
Right, and at various stages of POC, maybe.
That's great. It pays for a lot of dev training.
Right, there you go. Another good case study that we were looking at in the crypto space was USAA. So USAA Financial Services Company in the traditional space. So they have an interesting story. They got involved in crypto formally in 2015, where they became an investor in Coinbase. So I'm sure all of you know Coinbase, right? Largest exchange here in the US, one of the top exchanges in the world. And they became an investor in 2015. What was interesting is I met with one of the VC partners, I shouldn't say partner, one of the VC members of the innovations team working inside of USAA. And he said it was very exciting, and obviously it was new to crypto. Like Amber said, there's a lot of excitement, everybody wants to get involved. And so after they went in, they looked at some of the records, and they got the chance to know more about Coinbase, during the sort of the onboarding period where they became investors. They found out of all the banks where money was being ACH'd or sent to Coinbase to purchase Bitcoin, number 4 on that list was USAA. Now, I assure you, USAA is not a top 4 bank in the US, not even close. So they over-indexed, and what USAA discovered was, hey, there are a lot of people that are interested in Bitcoin that are our customers. Maybe we could serve them better, right? And so there was a sort of eye-opening discovery. Bitcoin is very experiential. It's much more better to be experienced than to be explained. And so Amber and I were joking about some of the banks that are getting involved in Bitcoin and blockchain, right? So they have a POC or they're looking at something, or they have someone assigned to it. That's my favorite, right? We have somebody looking into it, which is usually someone in a cubicle reading an articles, on a Friday afternoon when there's nothing going on. But it all comes down to, what are you actually doing, and do you actually have a proof of concept, and not being afraid to put it out there. Rather than chastising your employees in a bank for getting involved in Bitcoin, maybe you ought to take them out to lunch and figure out what the excitement's all about.
And I think that some of that is happening, but on a quieter basis than.
Yeah, probably.
We don't hear about it in the media. So one of the things that we often get as a question, one of the most common questions that both Joe and I hear from startups, is what can we possibly do to get an account? How do we help ourselves? How do we approach the banks? How do we talk about it? And I'm going to say up front, we can't guarantee that any of these strategies will be effective, but they're probably more effective than just showing up and praying and hoping for the best. Mm-hmm. We've had folks that have had really good results by looking at the banks that they want to approach and the blockchain and even sometimes Bitcoin projects that those banks are already doing. So whether or not you like Ethereum or the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, a lot of banks are involved. Whether or not you love Ripple, a lot of banks are involved. And when you approach that bank manager, because in many ways bank branches are little fiefdoms, and you say, hey, we notice you, Scotiabank, are one of the lead partners in the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. This is great. The project that I'm working on is also a blockchain project. We're interested in the same stuff. We're on the same team. That's really helpful. Looking at those relationships is huge, and treating it like a job interview. So when you show up, maybe not the raggediest t-shirt in the pile. It sounds goofy, but...
No, it sounds goofy, but it happens, right? They have sort of knapsack and sandals, and you walk in, and I'm shaking my head as I'm hearing my clients say this. You have to understand, this is a completely different world.
But I could do that, and
Right.
you could do that, and we would, it doesn't matter what I'm wearing, I'm going to leave the bank in an hour, and I'm going to have an account for my compliance consulting firm. No one cares. The risk level isn't the same.
Right. Everything you're doing
As long as you're wearing pants, you're probably good.
everything you're doing is under a microscope if you're in the crypto space. And one other thing to add, and I'll leave that slide up for another moment, one of the things we've noticed is if you had an existing relationship with a bank, that definitely helps, and don't be afraid to play that card. And at least here in the US, the big banks are unilaterally just not interested in crypto. You're better off going for a smaller bank or a credit union that maybe could be persuaded into opening an account that maybe doesn't have some hard and fast rule coming from the ivory tower.
And the last piece is having a clear takeaway. So the person that you meet that's on the front line is often not the person who ultimately makes a decision about whether or not you get to have or open or keep a bank account. So the more that you arm that person with an actual document, a business plan, and not like the business plan that you give your VCs that's 50 pages of slides, but 1 to 3 pages that say, here's how money comes in, here's how money comes out, here's what we have in common with your existing projects. Those are really helpful.
Yeah, and don't be overwhelming with paper. Well, bankers love paperwork, right? They love stacks of documents, but don't overwhelm them early on, right? You want to climb levels, as we say with our clients. Okay, do you bank MSBs? Okay, do you bank money transmitters? Okay. And then they get to that, do you bank cryptos? And so like kind of whisper over the phone, right? So you really have to be able to climb those levels and start having those conversations and work your way up. But ultimately be prepared to have all these things lined up, right? Whether or not it happens on the first visit, it's going to happen eventually. You're going to have to show them your AML program, your flow of funds, any legal memos, any citations you have, whether it's from an actual correspondence with a government agency or some sort of guidance or something that has been put out there into the community. Definitely want to have those at the ready. And obviously the Crypto 101 talk as well, right? So some bankers are sort of going to look at you like, what's this Bitcoin thing? I've heard about it. Isn't there something about Mt. Gox and something about that, right?
This is the thing. If you're not doing the education with an uninitiated person, their first point of learning is going to be Google. And so you can either give someone a very guided learning experience where they learn about Bitcoin and they learn about your business through you and through you providing resources that are helpful, or they learn about it by reading very alarmist articles and just hoping for the best.
I think in the Bitcoin community we have a marketing budget of 0, and I think Jamie Dimon has how many billions he can use for marketing? So a little bit of a disadvantage there, right? So sometimes we need to be a little bit more forward-thinking and a little bit more out there in terms of putting our information about the space out there, not just our company.
Absolutely. But although, on that note, if you've ever done one of these talks about your company, if you've done a TED Talk or a TEDx talk, if you've, as a friend of mine did, presented to the Canadian Senate, then you probably want to include those links in your package of materials that you provide, because those are really helping that person to understand and to take a look at it after and see that there is a context for what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. We had one of our clients presented to a southern state banking regulators, and they were sure to capture the whole moment. We worked on a memo together, made sure they had that in their packet, and the bank was just blown away. And not only that, the actual banking agency gave them a thank you note, which they copied, Xerox, sent me a copy, backed it up, and did everything they could because they thought that was outstanding. So don't be afraid to get out there and meet those audiences and get your word out there, and at the same time, show them for who you are, a legitimate business with a great idea, great innovation. It just so happens you can't find a bank account.
Yeah, it's silly that banking is the biggest barrier to entry in a first world country.
Seriously.
So I want to talk a little bit about in the absence of regulation, which is the Canadian situation. So on the U.S. side, it said if you're an exchange, then you're covered as a money transfer organization. In Canada, we don't have that. We had a bill that passed in 2014 that said that that would happen eventually. So dealers in virtual currency, not yet defined, were going to be money services businesses and regulated for anti-money laundering purposes. It hasn't happened yet. They can't register as money service businesses. And in the absence of that, what we've seen is banks and payment processors and other companies that deal with these businesses saying, well, we require you to have a compliance program if you're going to deal with them. And early on, those banks were saying, we actually need you to register as a money service business. And then the regulator was saying, no, you can't register. So there was a fun tension. I think that we're through that now, for the most part. But we're still seeing banks and payment processors that are acting as de facto regulators. This is, I think, something that we'll see until we have regulation. But if you are in that space and looking for a bank account, you have to be willing to show your bank what you're doing to mitigate risk. And I think that's important. From an anti-money laundering perspective, you probably have to be willing to share your terms and conditions, as well as other information about what you're doing to manage your risk within your business and to protect your end customer.
Going to the U.S., regulation nation, we have no shortage of federal agencies jockeying for position in terms of regulation. Really won't have time to go into these specifically, but just know that there are just so many categories, so many different regulators you can fall under. FinCEN has said that the movement of funds, or excuse me, the exchange of funds, crypto to fiat, fiat to crypto, or crypto to crypto, is generally considered money transmission. And then there's a federal and then a state level component where you have to go around and get a state license for every state in which you do business or operate. Right? And so we have some other agencies up there, sort of the government alphabet soup. CFTC has said in certain cases it's a commodity. The SEC has said in certain cases it's a security. And the IRS, for purposes of taxation, considers Bitcoin and other cryptos to be property. And please pay your taxes. The next regulatory front that we're going to see in the US, and we're actually already seeing it, and it's something that our firm's been following for the past year or so, is consumer protection. So anytime you have a sort of a nascent space that's dominated by nerds, and there's mainstream adoption to be had in the future, when that mainstream audience comes in, and that sort of communal environment we have grows to a large audience, and companies have trouble scaling, now you're getting into situations where people are having trouble doing things that maybe Amber and I take for granted about, using a wallet, transmitting funds, just general questions every day. And when that mainstream audience comes along and has trouble doing certain things in the space, and they're not getting answers because your customer service department hasn't scaled, well, guess what? They're going to go complain to the government. They're going to go complain to a regulator. And those consumer complaints are going to stack up. And government bureaucrat looks on their desk and has a bunch of complaints from company A. Well, guess what? They're going to contact company A. And we're already seeing that right now in the space, and I think that's going to continue to heat up as the space scales and as more mainstream audiences come on board.
Absolutely. So to anyone in the audience that does explainer videos, to anyone that does all of the education piece, thank you so much for that, because I think that's incredibly valuable for every company in the community.
Absolutely. And a lot of my clients actually put that on their website as a sort of early deterrent to any sort of consumer complaints or any contact, right? So there's a business interest too in posting this, right? So if you want to field calls all day on, how's my wallet work, right? Put up a video or something on your website, or make it easier for people to have those resources. And as Amber said, I would echo that thank you to anyone that just puts out some great content, Bitcoin 101, how to set up your wallet, just anything like that. It's really, really helpful, and you're helping more people than you think you are. We'll go to our last slide here and talk a little bit about law enforcement.
And so I think this is a bigger question in the US, but it affects us as well, which is that we read a lot of stories, and some of the most fascinating stories that people will send me are stories about, well, this person sold Bitcoin on local Bitcoin, and then they were arrested. And generally speaking, when you're doing peer-to-peer transactions, you are not the person that the police are looking for unless there's another component. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case 100% of the time. I haven't studied 100% of the cases. But in the cases that I have looked into, where it said someone's been charged with unlicensed money transfer business, there's a litany of other things. So you'll deal with things like a drug-related transaction, and then they'll pile on top of that unrelated or a related charge about operating an unlicensed money remittance business.
Right, and our firm, we were working with, we were presenting to the IRS. By the way, present company excluded, phenomenal crowd. I love presenting to the IRS. They're so fun to talk to. I don't know why, but they were very interested, and they were talking about some of their stories. And this is in the southwestern region of the U.S., and they were saying, Joe, we're really not interested in your clients, right? We're not interested in the people that are actually taking this seriously. Who we're arresting, to your point about local Bitcoins, are these 20-year-old punks that are selling us, they have a big wad of cash and they're selling us Bitcoin in a parking lot after we've told them 3, 4, 5 times that the money is from the Sinaloa drug cartel. So it's really, there's no shortage of low-hanging fruit, right? And I'm not trying to set the bar low, but I'm just trying to point out that maybe some of the things that you're reading about aren't necessarily an indication of everybody in the marketplace, right? So well, actually there is no secret, right? The secret is to get out there, find out if you're regulated, and take the necessary compliance steps.
Yeah, and to what Joe just alluded to, I think the first time that I saw Charlie Shrem speak, he had a very good point about when you have the smoking gun. So when you have a piece of information like that, you don't get to ignore it. You don't get to be willfully blind, or it's very easy to make you complicit in that, or to believe that you're complicit in that. And so if you know something like that, you have to think about, what do I do to protect myself and my business?
Right, and Finson has said that willful blindness is the same thing as actual knowledge. So to your point, the government has already said that.
Beauty. So we have a screen in front of us that says, your time has expired. Please end your talk now. Please
I hear the Jaws theme.
Please come and see us if you have any questions, and if you would like to go on a long litany about the government or regulators and why you don't like them, Malbec, craft beer. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good talk. 10-minute break, and we'll be back in this room for one more speaker. Don't go away. 10 minutes.